David, thank you for taking the time.
Great to be here, Michael.
And when you look at the poll, what stands out for you in terms of misinformation, disinformation?
Well, I think a few things. First is there is already widespread, I would say, awareness and concern about misinformation and disinformation. There's widespread concern about the state of our democracy, and there's broad recognition that the world we live in, how we get information, who creates that information and shares it, is distorting our sense of reality, our ability to solve problems collectively, and ultimately might be influencing, at some level, the kind of democracy we end up having. So I think we've very quickly found fairly common and broad agreement, despite vast disagreements on a lot of things. The left and the right, east or west, young or old, are almost all united in saying this is a problem, and so, but there's no real sense of how do we solve it.
Okay, let me pick up on that point here. I'm going to read this because according to the poll, 84% of respondents said they were concerned about the spread of misinformation, disinformation. So when you talk about commonalities and people speaking forward, that seems to reflect it. But does that number seem high to you? It
is high. You know, I mean, you might say, given what we know as folks who cover and follow politics closely, that should be 99% or 100%. But 84% of Canadians agreeing on a problem is rare these days. Like, the only other one that we tested in this survey, and I've seen in other surveys that more people agree is a problem, is the cost of living, as an example. So I say 84% is a really high number. It's indicative of the broadness of this concern. And as I've noted earlier, this crosses the political spectrum, right? Not all issues do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me pick up on a couple of other numbers here, because the poll also showed that 1/5 of Canadians, so 20%, do not get their news from traditional news, and younger Canadians, those between 18 to 29, were more apt to get their news and current affairs through social media. Would you conclude from those numbers then that more young people are more apt to be receivers of misinformation, disinformation, if they're getting it through social media?
Yeah, absolutely. They're more likely to be getting that information through those sources. They admit it, they believe it, and in this highly fragmented media ecosystem, right, where depending on how old you are, what language you speak, where you live in the country, you may be getting very different types of information. You may not be seeing what's going on in one part of the country or the other, and particularly younger Canadians have the ability to curate their news. They can decide what they're interested in, and they may not be tuning into your program or others and getting a broad breadth of information. And so I really do think that younger Canadians in particular are more likely to be exposed to this stuff simply because that's where they are. Not because they are more susceptible to it or aren't aware that it might be there. It's just simply where they live, and as a result, and that's where we know most misinformation and disinformation lives as well.
So what does that say then about trust in traditional news media? How does that finding translate over?
Well, there's two things happening. I mean, we have seen for a while now trust in most institutions deteriorating, right? That Canadians of all ages, of all political persuasions, are just less likely to trust government, news media, journalists, any really authoritative source of either information or power. People are now questioning. But what also drives that, so we become kind of in this spiral, is that the less of it you consume and the more content that sometimes is questioning the validity of the work that you do, Michael, for example, is further pulling people to a place where they're skeptical of what they read. They're wondering, is this true or not? And I think we've come to a point where we're long gone are the days where news anchors, for example, had authority that everybody would tune into and say, okay, that's what's happening. We can at least agree on what's happening, why it's happening, and then let's debate how we solve it or what the best course of action is. Increasingly, because of this fragmented ecosystem, we don't even agree on what the problem is anymore, and I think that explains the polarization we see in our politics.
Listen, you know, another interesting trend here is that the survey shows that more conservatives, or people who identify themselves as conservatives, more of those respondents to the right of the spectrum are concerned about the state of our democracy. Why do you think conservatives, again, those who identify perhaps more right, are expressing greater concern than those who consider themselves more left of the spectrum?
Well, I think the first reason is they just don't like what the current government's doing, and they see that government, the Liberal government, as to the left of the political spectrum. So there is a natural inclination. This isn't necessarily new, that those who don't like what a government's doing may ultimately get to a place where they think that the state of democracy's at risk. But I think it's become more intense than it ever was, right? 30 years ago, two sides of an issue may have disagreed, but they didn't fundamentally believe the system was broken or that democracy was at risk. But I do think that because of the pandemic and how a lot of people felt government and decisions were being made and forced on them, that was a small subset of the population, but still a sizable one, felt kind of constrained in what they were able to do, and then that deteriorated trust that this is just the spiral that is creating this sense of not just, I don't like Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government, but maybe I'm starting to question whether Elections Canada can administer an election fairly, or that news organizations are accurately and reliably covering the day's events. These are all things that feed that idea, and it starts with someone just being suspect of their motivations. And we've seen that Canada's not immune. Obviously, we've seen this particularly in the United States, but around the world as well.
This survey showed that 63% are concerned about the erosion of liberties and freedoms. And I'm thinking about, you say about the frustration and how people are feeling. We saw those concerns about liberties and freedoms around the pandemic, particularly around the vaccines. When you look at the numbers in 2021, the last time Canadians went to the polls, versus the numbers now, how would you compare those trend lines?
Well, I think that stat about civil liberties, I think, is a two-sided coin, right? There are some in Canada who believe governments generally are constricting their ability to live the life that they want. And I think the pandemic and requiring people to get vaccinated is a perfect example of that in play. But I also think there's another side that are just deeply concerned about the trend towards authoritarianism that we're seeing in places that we thought were like the heartland of democracy. Think of the United States, or imagine, how people react to seeing the Capitol building stormed on January 6th. These are all images now that, we never thought, most Canadians didn't experience World War II, don't really understand what it's like to feel that those freedoms are actually potentially at risk. So there's two sides of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, 73% of respondents said that they believe disinformation is affecting already the upcoming elections. How do you shift those numbers? What might actually turn that perception around?
Well, I think that's a hard one. I think it starts with trust, which is something that's in very short supply these days. How do you get people? I guess the real question is, how do you get people to believe that there are systems in place that are fair, that are objective, and that are somehow creating an environment where they can feel trusted again? I mean, one of the other interesting stats from the survey was only 1 in 3 Canadians say they are frequently fact-checking information they see online, despite the fact that a majority believe they're being exposed to a lot of incorrect or inaccurate information. That's telling us that gap still exists between people who want to actively find out whether this information is real or not, and those that think they're getting exposed to it. And that's the real problem. So I think part of the solution, I don't think misinformation or disinformation is going away. I think that's just the nature of the ecosystem we now live in. And I think it's always been there, right? Like I always used to think of, it was before my days, but in other countries, foreign powers would fly over with planes and drop pamphlets or papers in trying to influence public opinion in those countries. Now we can do it subversively, privately, in on people's devices. So the solution has to be not that we can somehow, we can try to combat it and put in place things that might make that harder to happen, but I think we have to arm electors, arm citizens with the ability to make sense of it. And that requires, I believe, a really strong news media, right? One that's trusted, one that's well-resourced, because ultimately that's still a place where people aren't willing to say they completely trust, not you, Michael, but folks who do what you do, but still believe that you're going to be a part of the structure that keeps a democracy strong.
David, thank you very much for the time.
Thanks, Michael.